Hi, I'm Sir Wade, and I'm an animator. I've been using Maya for almost 10 years, and while I really like it, there's a lot of other tools that keep coming out, or have been out, that I have just wanted to learn for years at this point. And honestly, it's been a little frustrating because I used to be someone who would spend every single day watching tutorials and trying new things and making little short films and projects and all kinds of stuff. But as I've been getting older, I just don't have much time to do those kinds of things. And at this point, I've just become so frustrated with that process and that cycle that I decided, screw it, let's just dive in. And for anyone who's new here, I'm not into the whole, you must choose one, you can only have one 3D software, pick the best, blah, blah, blah. Be like Batman, have a utility belt with lots of good stuff in there. So here's the plan. Start with the most basic animation assignment that everybody has had to do a billion times, the bouncing ball. After that, we're gonna work our way up the difficulty scale until we get to a full acting shot. And I have a bunch of shots and exercises planned along the way. But before we jump into the bouncing ball, I need to figure out how the heck this software works for animation. The hotkeys are all over the place, the names are all different, and I really have no idea what's going on. So let's start with some research and some prep for this whole process. A year ago, I was fortunate enough to have a Zoom call with Hjalti Hjalmarsson. He is like the main animation guy at Blender, as far as I know, and super, super nice. He showed me his workflow, explained how he used Blender, told me all kinds of cool hotkeys and things he had set up, and luckily I took good notes, so I was able to review those. Next, I checked out Luciano's videos, The Adventures of Lollipop Man. He's got some good videos for getting set up, some great tips on setting up your shot and just wrapping your head around with everything that's going on. And I went to the Blender Cloud to download some rigs for my adventures, as well as watching a few other tutorials from the people at Blender themselves. And I know I'm going to get comments of people saying, you know, you can just change the hotkeys to match Maya, right? I don't want to do that. I'm not trying to make my Blender session feel like Maya. I'm trying to learn Blender for what it is. Don't let your attachment to one dictate how you use the other. It's just going to frustrate you. And speaking of frustrations, I spent the first 20 minutes of this entire process trying to figure out how the heck to link the bouncing ball rig into my file. And again, people always tell me you should just append it, it's easier, but that's not how you would do it in a production workflow. One of the things I was struggling with was that when I wanted to do two different balls in the same scene, I linked both of them and for some reason they were connected. But when I'd move one or change one, they'd both update and it was super weird. I did the whole proxy rigs thing and I could not find anything online as to how to fix this problem. So I just made a copy of the file and referenced the other one. So each of them were linked, but they were linked to copies of them. It doesn't matter. I made it work. That's all that I care about. But as far as ball bounces, what I like to do is start with a sentient ball, one that sits on the ground and decides to bounce. You get to choose how kind of squishy or bouncy it is. And this is what that looked like. So there I was, working, focused, in this zone, not realizing the hours passing me by.
No! What year is it?
Not remembering the last time I'd tasted the sweet nectar of life. But I'm motivated, I'm animating. I'm not gonna lose this momentum. I can't be bothered to go grocery shopping. And unfortunately, not everything is open at 3 a.m. Plus, I can't keep eating out. It's getting too expensive.
I declare bankruptcy!
That's where HelloFresh comes in, the sponsor of this video because I asked them to sponsor it. It's what I actually use to make sure I don't wither away while I work. A delicious, time-saving, and flexible option that I actually think you'll like a lot. I've used it for months outside of the sponsorship, and I pay for it like everybody else. I usually hit the quick and easy menu preference and pick the meals I want to eat in a week. A box shows up with all the fresh ingredients properly portioned in recyclable packaging for sustainability, along with any meats that go with the dishes. You get step-by-step instructions with the pre-measured ingredients, so even if you've never cooked before, it's pretty much impossible to mess it up.
Crunchy eggshells ruin those muffins.
It's less expensive than eating out all the time and saves hours on grocery shopping. Also, it ensures that I don't come home with a ton of impulse buys. Welcome to the cooking show for lazy animators like me. Let's put on our Disney apron and also look at this great oven mitt thing I have. I've also been able to learn how to cook my own dishes from the recipes. They're all like little cooking tutorials, so you can apply the stuff you learn to other meals, and the options are super varied, so you can have a solid breakfast, lunch, dinner, even sides and desserts are choices you can make. And you can always skip a week if you do want to live off pizza for 7 days with all the money you saved from your smart choices. This is what I ate all week throughout this challenge, but I figured a lot of other artists watching may also not have a regular eating schedule because food can be time consuming and expensive. So if you want to try HelloFresh for yourself, there's a link in the notes below and you can use my code SirWade14 to get up to 14 free meals across your first 5 boxes. So just remember what Chef Gusteau said.
Anyone can cook, but only the fearless can be great.
And there we go. that is lunch. Not too bad, right? Next up, it was time for 2 balls of different weights. Now, back when I went to Animation Mentor, an online animation school, this is actually the assignment I did back then. 2 balls of different weights, one light, one heavy, and I put them on these little seesaw block things because I wanted them to interact, but in a more creative and indirect way. And I was really proud of this little thing right here. See that little tiny detail? Yeah, I was stoked on that. The goal here, the reason I started with these in particular, was because I work in the graph editor constantly. It's just where I live, it's where I love to be, and I need to figure out how the heck to use the graph editor in Blender. But all of this was so much more frustrating than I thought it was going to be, because there were little things that I found out through my research that I could do. Like, I knew you could switch the dope sheet and the graph editor really quickly, and I literally spent like 20 to 30 minutes trying to find the stupid thing in the hotkey editor and make that hotkey, or find online where you can update that, or is it an add-in, like an add-on? What do you do to make that happen? I just clicked the hotkey with my mouse over the window and it worked. And I realized that I'm a complete idiot. So pro tip, Control Tab in the dope sheet or graph editor switches between the two, and you don't need to do anything. It just works. But there's a bunch of stuff in Blender that I did not know how to do. I could not figure out how to get things done. For example, working in the graph editor, I wanted to zero out values. You just hit Alt-G and it resets the transformation, and it's super easy. And it took me forever to find that out. I wish I had more friends who animate in Blender, because this could have been a lot easier if I had someone to talk to about these things. The other thing that frustrated me was how hard it is to filter your view in the graph editor. In Maya, you just click on the names of things and it filters them. You don't have to really think about it too much. In Blender, I had to go through all the little hide visibility buttons to do it, which just took a little bit longer. I also, for the life of me, could not figure out how to grab a bunch of the tangent handles. If you grab multiple keys and you want to grab the handles and adjust them all on just one side, for example, I couldn't find any way to do that. This is what it looks like in Maya, but this is my process in Blender, and I have no idea what I'm doing wrong here. Lucky for me, I had a helper, and she kept my morale up the whole time. By the way, if you don't know Luna, now you do. You're welcome. Listen to this. Hi. For the record, we've been living in Texas for the last year, and our air conditioner broke. So it was like 100 degrees at 4 in the morning, and I woke up from the heat and decided to start animating because it'd only get hotter from there. So if I look a little tired, oh, now you know why. I think the hardest thing during this process, even this early on, was remembering all the information that goes into the craft of animating, as well as trying to learn the technical side of it. I was so focused on figuring out the technical that I was forgetting basic animation stuff, and I wouldn't catch things until much later than I normally would. For example, I went on this whole rant about spacing because I realized I had animated this other ball coming down and bouncing and whatever, and I realized it was 11 frames of a super linear interpolation for this ball to come from the top to the bottom, and then the speed at which it bounced off of the wall was completely wrong. And it took me an embarrassingly long time to notice that, because I was so focused on the workflow and the process of learning how to do the stuff that I just wasn't really looking at my animation. And eventually I finished the ball bounce stuff. This is what it looked like. It's not perfect, but you know what? It was done close enough. Time to move on. The next thing I decided to jump to was a walk cycle with a character. Now, this was a bit rocky. The lessons I was really trying to pick up from this exercise was copy pasting, how to get one curve working, repurpose it somewhere else, and there's just a ton of stuff I couldn't figure out. I didn't know how to manipulate multiple controls I had selected, which I eventually figured out. You just alt-click and drag the different attributes, but I didn't know this at the time. Unfortunately, with this rig, the elbows were inverted, so if you grabbed both elbows and typed a value of 10, one would go forward and one would go back because they were reversed versions of each other. I also didn't know that you could paste flipped at the time. I will say though, the Alt-G or Alt-R or Alt-whatever to reset the pose, that's great. I love that. I had to make a hotkey in Maya to be able to do that, so I like that that's built in. Anyways, I worked on this for a little bit and then decided, you know what, close enough, good enough, I got the gist, I got what I needed, and I'm not trying to make a demo reel piece. This is gonna do. I'm going to bed. And that's exactly what I did. But I will say, I was starting to feel pretty accomplished moving through this as quickly as I was, because I was learning the stuff. It was frustrating at times, it was exciting at other times, and ultimately, I was doing it.
You're doing it! Peter, look, you're doing it, see?
Bangarang.
Moving into the next day, I learned a valuable lesson. It was time to stop comparing the software. I kept thinking, oh, how I do it this way in Maya, how will I do it in Blender? And that's really not a healthy way to do this. You need to learn a tool free of the expectations and look at it fresh. There are just certain things that aren't the same. Like the middle mouse button is super useful in Maya, and I wasn't finding that I was using it for anything hardly in Blender. And so I'd have all kinds of complaints in my head of, I could do this with the middle mouse button in Maya, I can't do it with Blender. And it bothered me until I realized that there's just a different way to do it. And then it was fine. If I hadn't have been thinking of how Maya does it, I wouldn't have been so mad at Blender. And so to this point, I started really trying to take a step back and just learn the stuff as its own software. This is where my original plan completely went out the window. Because originally I had planned on a 7-day production schedule to do a bunch of the basic exercises, the ball with the tail, the pendulum. I was going to do all these different mechanics exercises with the lifting of a box and changing of expression, all this stuff. And then I realized I'm not trying to relearn animation. I'm just trying to learn a new tool and the workflow associated with it. The other thing that was really difficult is that I still have stuff to do. I'm not just animating. Like still have a lot of things going on in life right now. And so this whole 1 week challenge was getting very difficult, and it was literally like the first or second day. So I decided to step it up a notch. Let's just go bring in a full character rig and see what happens.
Your soul is forfeit.
The first priority was to test drive a full character rig, figure out which controls I want to use for blocking and for posing, and just get a sense of how it works. And I thought maybe I'll just do a practice exercise. That could be an option. Something instead of what people usually consider a demo reel shot. I could just do a blink, just the dialogue. And by dialogue, I don't mean a whole acting shot, just the lips, just the mouth, maybe a head turn, maybe something with a hand, a yawn, just a smile. Doesn't matter, something small, manageable. But that would have been too easy. That would have been too straightforward. And that is not in my nature, apparently. So instead, I went looking for reference, found something on TikTok, and began to set up my shot. I also noticed that Rain has the weirdest butt of any rig I've ever seen. I don't think this is supposed to look like this. Why does it look like this? I hate it. I don't want it. Take it back. Fix it. And if you've been watching this channel for a long time, you might remember some of the interviews we've had. For example, Simon Otto, the head of character animation on all 3 How to Train Your Dragon movies. When I interviewed him, he gave a really great piece of advice.
You have to give yourself goals. By this time, I will have achieved this. I will have blocked to frame 240. And you really hit that. You try and really hit that. I think the biggest enemy in getting stuff done is perfection. Do that at the end, fix it at the end. You told me you have some workflow videos. Stick with the workflow. Like you have to have a workflow. Think about my shot, shoot reference, do some drawings. Once I have that, I block through my shots on 8s or something, or I just do the body blocking or whatever, whether you're layered or pose to pose, or define the moments when you say, now I'm going to edit what I did. You have to separate editing and improving what you have and going through and doing something. Those are 2 separate processes. And when you start mixing those things up, you meander and you start spending a lot of time.
One of the best traits is to just start working, start blocking your shot, and just keep going until you're done. Don't get distracted by anything. It's something everybody struggles with, but you've got to learn to overcome that. And so for me, it was time to just start blocking out the shot. So while I was blocking, there were a bunch of things that came up, things that I made notes of that I wanted to share. For example, you don't want to take the shot too far or all the way to completion without getting some feedback, or you risk redoing a lot of work. Animation's a team sport, and getting feedback is what really helps bring your work to the next level, or at least to make sure the intentions that you have for the shot are actually clear and that the viewer will receive them without any other explanation. So my goal at this point was really just to block out the shot and not get bogged down by all the technical details like props and constraints. Those things can slow you down and halt your progress entirely if you focus too much on them. I figured out how to use constraints, and that was all fine. It took me a while, some Googling and all that. But one thing that I can share, and if you haven't seen my other videos on prop animation or IKFK, they're great videos, they work for any tool, and it's how I actually knew how to do this. When you are setting up a prop to use with the hands, in most cases, if it's something small like a pen or a cup or whatever, you should constrain stuff not to the wrist, not to the arm, not to the hand itself, but to a finger. Because most people don't animate just an IK or just an FK, they will switch back and forth. And I do that in this shot. I knew I was going to have to switch from IK to FK for the different parts of the shot. So if you stick to a finger, it doesn't matter which skeleton you're using. The fingers are the fingers, and the hands are the things that switch, the hands and the arm. So just stick it to a finger, be done with it. But it was going fairly well. It was actually working. I was animating. I was making progress. Things stopped going quite so well. There's an add-on I put in Blender, which gives me this ease thing in the graph editor. It's kind of like a tween machine, and it was nice at times, but it needs some work. Anytime I used a ton of controls with the slider, it would hang up. The whole software would just freeze up, whether I used the slider or the little buttons. It didn't matter. That's not great. It was just faster to crash it and pose it myself. So I'd love to see some work done there. Now there is a built-in thing called the breakdowner, and that's only a partial solution. I don't love how the UI element isn't by the mouse when you hit the button, it's like over in the corner. And also it worked with everything that was selected. You couldn't isolate just selected graph editor curves or something, things that Animbot can do. So it's better than nothing, but it is only a partial solution. But here's probably one of the biggest things. This was awful. The Rain Rig IKFK hand switching, it's a nightmare. I don't know if this is the Rain Rig or if it's the Cloud Rig like add-on thing, whatever this is, but oh man, this thing needs some work. First of all, the snap doesn't work 100%. Now, that's not that big of a deal. It's not a deal breaker, but I would like to see the snap actually be accurate because it would change locations. More importantly though, the visibility thing sucks. If I went from IK to FK or vice versa, it doesn't matter. If I'm in one arm layout, setup, whatever, and I switch to the other one, it disappears. Now, usually that's normal because you switch to the other one, you don't need to see the one you're not using. But then you scroll back into your timeline before you keyed that into where you were using the other one. You don't see it. It doesn't show it. You can't show both. You switch the IK FK switches, do whatever you want, and it just, bleh. I should be able to turn it on and turn it off with the IK FK buttons, regardless of which skeleton I'm actively in. It was so frustrating and I hated it. Also, there were all kinds of weird generated graph editor curves that were super buggy. I know that that's definitely not supposed to happen. And while we're talking about the Rain Rig, there are some things missing. For example, the cheek puff. It doesn't have a control to go in. You can only puff out, and only a certain amount. You can't really push it further, which is unfortunate, but it's not that big of a deal. But the fact that it doesn't suck in was a bummer, because especially for this chewing shot, I wanted it to feel fleshy and organic and super fun. And so I decided to take it upon myself to learn how to add a custom control. In a separate Blender window, I opened the original Rain file and figured out how to add a shape key, re-sculpt the face into what I wanted, and put a driver to push it through the reference. Now, I could not figure out how to actually create like a bone or like a control to do this, and I didn't put a lot of time into it, to be honest. So I just made a cube and locked its rotation to that shape key that I turned on. But this is ultimately why you want to link or reference your rigs versus importing them. I now have a Rain file that I could load back into my shot. I then had that control, I could add it to my shot, but I am able to share this if I were working on a bigger project with other artists, and we could all use it non-destructively without affecting our work or having any issues. I was super proud of myself for this one. And it's important to remember that blocking is really just to communicate the intentions of the shot, for posing, for acting, and especially timing. And when you're doing these little projects for exercise and learning, it's also nice if you can scale it back. If you pick something that you are able to cut in half if you really need to, which is what I decided to do. I only animated about half of the audio that I originally wanted to, from like 800 frames down to 300, because it's about as far as I got, and I really didn't have the time to keep going. It was at this point that I realized I should get some eyes on this. So I got some feedback from a good friend of mine, Bo Pratt. Bo and Cameron Pratt run the PrattBros stream over on Twitch. I'll link to that down below if you guys want to check it out. It's fantastic. Great learning resource. They're amazing teachers and they really know their stuff. Super helpful for learning animation. I got a ton of good notes on my work. There were a few ideas that I hadn't considered that got brought up that I should do. One note in particular was that this moment with the eye direction wasn't really reading. He couldn't really tell like what the character was thinking.
It's right in between her being childish, where like, let's say a parent says, don't eat that, and the kid goes, and she also feels genuinely curious, whereas like, oh, don't eat that, but I want to. It's not really clear where she's kind of looking.
All fair, all good points, because if it's not clear, it's not working. Doesn't matter what I want it to be or what I intend. If it's not clear, it's not working. So I knew I had some work to do. By the way, if you want any one-on-one feedback time with me, We have Patreon Studio Dailies. It's a community feedback area to learn from other people's shots like you would in a studio and get direct critiques on your own work. We do them twice a week over on Zoom, and I'll put a link to that in the description. So if you want to come check out the Patreon, there's all kinds of fun stuff, all kinds of good stuff to help support these videos. Which, by the way, if you're enjoying this, please hit the thumbs up. Really helps with the whole YouTube thing. I appreciate it. And subscribe if you haven't already. It's free. You can always change your mind. So thanks. Now, as I was addressing the notes from feedback, I decided to jump into LipSync. I wanted to get a little bit deeper in there, and this is where I really just hated my life. I hated everything about this process. It's not playing enough of the audio for me to get an understanding of the dialogue. There is a chance that I just didn't know what I was doing in Blender. That is entirely possible, that maybe there's a better way to do it, and I just hadn't found it. If it's not a default behavior and it's not easy to just stumble across the right way to do it, and you end up in my situation where I'm just doing something and being frustrated, that's not ideal. And also, if there's just not a better way to do it, well then, no. No. The audio scrubbing experience was awful. There were so many dropped frames that I couldn't scrub through my timeline and hear what they were saying reliably on each frame. I had no idea where the lip shapes needed to be because I couldn't find out where the sounds were actually hitting. Blender's timeline is basically useless for animators, so you really do all your work in the dope sheet or the graph editor, and I'd love to be able to see the waveform in either or both of those places. But I'm sure there's a way to show the waveform, I just didn't know. The real problem was the real-time playback and all the dropped frames. The fact that I could never hear the audio while I was animating, that was a pain. I hated it. LipSync was such a struggle because of that. Some of this was definitely just the learning curve of me having to get used to things, but other parts of the process, I feel it's worth a critique, and I can't wait to see what the devs are doing for Blender 3.0 because this definitely needs some work. And honestly, at this point, I was done. I was fried and finished, and I got enough of it working that I felt like I had a handle on things, and it would have just kind of been more of the same, and I really just didn't have any more time. We were out of time on this challenge. So I called it, partway through blocking, or blocking plus, or wherever you would say this is, where you definitely know what's going on, and I feel like I kind of messed a few things up that I wanted to fix, but you know what? A little bit of the acting needed some context, and so I decided to do some set dressing. Since the video was sponsored by HelloFresh, I wanted to just put the box in there to make it seem like maybe she was eating HelloFresh, and this is just entirely my call. I just wanted to put that in there for fun. So I figured out how to do some UV stuff, stick a logo on a box. I needed to put a little plate of chips, and I could not figure out how to do that easily. So I just decided to create an emitter and simulate some chips onto a plate. I also made a procedural watermelon just to test my shader abilities. I really like the shader workflow in Blender. That's one of my favorite parts to do, actually. And while this was not needed at all, I really wanted to do lighting because I also really like that part of Blender too. So I used the skylight world node to get most of the way there, some windows to cast some interesting shadows, and because I'm not a masochist, I didn't want to model a whole background. So instead I just grabbed a background image with matching light direction to save some time, blur it, color correct it, and do some light compositing. I really should have created a shot camera first, but I made it work fine. I did need to switch the test eyes back to the normal eyes that she's supposed to have, because that's not what I want at all, and figure out how to render on alpha, which is this thing here. After some light compositing, this is the shot.
Dude, it's really hot.
What do you mean?
Don't put it down. You put that on my plate. Don't eat that. It's really hot.
It's not that hot. It's not that.
Obviously it's not done, but you get the gist. I think this kind of gets it across. And you know what? I am proud of myself. I did not think that I was going to be able to get this far in this amount of time. To answer the question of can you learn Blender's animation tools in like a week? The answer is yes, especially if you have some background in other software. Because I am very familiar with Maya and other 3D tools, it definitely helped. But regardless, I really just didn't expect it to go as well as it did. I feel like this shot actually has a lot of potential. It has promise. It actually isn't a bad animated shot. I feel like if someone were to watch this, if I were job hunting, it's definitely not finished. It's not polished. Like it's not ready for a demo reel, but I feel like it's actually in a good direction. Unlike the walk cycle, which I think is actually really stiff and bland and it's just kind of weird to look at. I'm not a huge fan of how that turned out, but that was, again, really trying to figure out the workflow of the graph editor. But once I get into the more advanced stuff and really spent some time doing a bunch of different things, I feel like it all kind of came together. But I'm interested to know what you think. When you clicked on this video and you saw the challenge, Did you think it was actually going to work out to this point? Did I exceed your expectations or did I fall short? Please let me know in the comments. Let me know if you found anything in here useful that you didn't know before, or if you've got any tips for me, because I had a lot of problems and I'd like to fix them if possible. Anyways, if you've enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. It makes a huge difference. And a huge thank you as well to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video, because since I do have HelloFresh and I've used it for months, I really like it. I think it's a really good thing for artists who don't have a lot of time. If you want to eat well, eat healthy, and feel good as you sit and wither away on the computer, you should definitely check it out with that link in the description. But thanks again for watching. I'm Sir Wade, and I'll see you in the next video. Alice, who you might know from the Blender videos, my editor, is no longer my editor. She's starting a new animation job. We're excited for her. We're also sad. So leave some nice comments down below for her, congratulating her on the new gig. And I gotta find a new editor. So yeah, that's gonna be fun. Oh.